So, like, just a couple of news. I think that it's interesting for our uh, for people who aren't in this part of the discussion, but not this weekend, but in the next weekend, we will have the second international STP conference. I'm counting the first one as that meeting some of you guys had at New York. We had, I think there were people from different states, and I think Reza he's from Canada, right? So I think that counts as international. And Gabriel is from Brazil, so. And in a couple, not this weekend, but in the next one, we will have a meeting. And what we are trying to do, I mean, just so we can loop everybody in, is we are trying to establish, I think, some, like, because I think that when you meet in person, there are some bonds that you can establish. And I think we will have a space to present our ideas externally. We are trying to do an event like that, which will be probably not this Friday, but the next one. We still haven't decided where. And did I freeze? Did I freeze? Or was it Renzo? Oh no, okay. Bruno is moving, so I can see that I'm not stuck. So we will have this, it's like going to be 2 or 3 days of an event. One day externally, to present our ideas to a public. I don't even know if that public exists. It probably doesn't, but we will find out. And then on the weekend, we will probably have meetings to discuss, I think, questions internal to the group. We're going to have a translation of the Thinking Through Organizations piece. It will probably be a different translation than the one we are going to work for the Crisis and Critique piece because of time constraints. And the idea is to see if we can strengthen the relations between people, so we can get to work in a more, like, if we can be more organized between ourselves. So we will probably try and do a report or some kind of we'll try to produce something that discusses and synthesizes what happened in these few days. So we are very excited. We hope this is, and I do hope we can have like one international meeting, like could be in the middle point, like maybe in Panama or something like that. Would be nice. Let's hope we can do this in a few years' time at most. But like, besides from that, and also the meeting and the Crisis and Critique text, we decided to do a meeting today to talk about case studies. And this is like more an open meeting. We don't have a clear idea of where we're going, but I do think that it touches upon one of the problems that this group has been trying to go around, which is, I think, in a sort of way, the problem of transmission of these experiences that we are trying to formalize. Because in a sense, I think that not only is it important to be able to understand and to think through organizations, if we take into account the title of the text we are going to publish in Crisis and Critique, but I think the problem of how to transmit these ideas, what are the formats, what kind of investigations elicit some sort of formats, etc. I think this is something that we can discuss. So I thought about starting by, let me just see if I can get I have these diagrams, which is a part of them. I showed them when we were talking to Marcel, and I hope I didn't scare him too much. But it started initially with a question, which is based in the Trinitarian organizational principles, which is the interaction. Wait, that's not it. interaction, composition, and intelligibility. Folks, I'll just try and find wherever I hit this diagram. There are too many windows open. I found it. Let's just hope my computer doesn't crash. Okay. I think this is it. Okay, I think I'm sharing the right screen. You guys are seeing the one with the diagram page loading?
Yeah, it's loading.
Okay.
Now it's
okay.
loaded.
Okay, thanks. Well, so let me just explain a bit how this began. These diagrams may be mixed in Portuguese and English, but they're not too complicated, so I don't think there will be a problem. But basically, we were trying to think, and this is partly inspired by Renzo's presentation on elements of political economy of social struggles. And the idea was try to see what kind of discursive frameworks existed that, in a sense, took into account the principles for analyzing organizational structures. So we have this Trinitarian structure, which is composition, interaction, and intelligibility. And this is from a discussion between me and Gabriel. We were talking about these various practices of description, such as ethnography, the psychoanalytical case studies, and also political conjectures. And in a first moment, we tried to organize to see how we would map these discursive practices into our framework. So is it possible to see like what these kinds of practices, what they are, how they are established, I mean, in their own fields? Do they privilege some point of the organizational structure that they will make visible, etc.? Or they mobilize some point of this element? Or do they account for all of them, for none of them? How does this work out? And since we are dealing with a framework that borrows heavily in many different moments from anthropology, from political militant analysis, and also from I don't think the psychoanalytic elements enters not too directly, but I think it's there, especially if we consider the background of our participants. But we tried to see if we could map them out and see what happens. That was our first plan. And when we did this first mapping, we found that, well, if you take into account, and this is the problem with mapping these things is that you never know. That's my problem. You never know if these things make sense, or if you are like turning the thing just to fit nicely into whatever you are doing. But if we take into account, for example, the psychoanalytical discourse, which is, I think, something that is very peculiar, very different from other types of social analysis, I think we can see a bit nicely that there is a problem in the psychoanalytical discourse that is present in the whole psychoanalytical tradition, which is the problem of transmission. This is a discursive practice that deals with singularities, that tries to, in its practice, in its elaboration as a discourse, to affect certain people, namely analysts and those who are analyzed. And in a sense, this is also a discourse that works through the composing of different bits and pieces into, not into a whole, but in a sense it is, in a sense, a work of composition. So, for example, if we take into account our Trinitarian principle, we can see that the psychoanalytical discourse, it, in a sense, mixes different elements into a single composition. And in this composition, it also seeks to interact with the subject involved in this field. But, and this is the whole problem, I think, of psychoanalysis from Freud to Lacan and so on, you cannot develop a science of this practice in the universal, in the sense of which other sciences will develop. There is no intelligibility of this subject because the problem at hand is precisely the singularity of the subjects. So there is no universalizing act that is possible. You cannot say, you cannot define once and for all what are the relevant differences for all subjects. And this is a point I think that I've been discussing that has appeared in some conversation with me, Renzo, and Vinicius. We are currently reading Freud's project together. And one thing that is very interesting in the book, I don't know if Renzo agrees with me on this, but it seems that when you take into account, he's trying to establish like a scientific theory of psychoanalytical practice. And then he starts discussing like neurons and connections, and there's this type of excitation, and it's all very neurological in a sense. But when he starts to talk about like suffering that in a sense we interpreted as connected to sense, it's connected to personal experience, the discourse, it gets all messed up. There's no clean connection between the neurological materialist descriptions and the descriptions that are involved with the problems of the subjects themselves. So in a sense, when we are constructing this little drawing, we figured that psychoanalytical clinical discourse, it was structurally, it structurally touched on all the points, but it touched on one of the points, it touched as a blind spot. So there's a blind spot in psychoanalysis that exists in regards to intelligibility. When we analyze from another point of view, anthropology, the anthropological discourse, we can see that we have a discourse that also seeks to compose differences they are also concerned with organizing, for example, myths, rituals, ordinary practices, and then they are all composed. And not only are they composed, but they are interpreted as in regards to the differences that make differences in these communities. So it's not only a matter of composing, but also in making visible the differences that make a difference. And this is, I think this, if we take into account the history of anthropology, these differences, they are very relevant for generally the colonial powers that are funding the anthropological enterprise. Because if we take into account the development of the history of anthropology, it is only very recently that these discourses are not subordinated to interests of governments, etc. It's because of how they are funded, how they are used. I mean, to these days, you still have anthropologists working for interested parties in destroying or controlling certain people. So we have this discourse that, like in the graph, it deals, in a sense, it is a composition. We are organizing elements of social reality that that make a difference in these different parts, and this is done in a way that makes it intelligible, in a sense that these differences are, you can see the differences that make a difference for society. And I mean, we can even see that this is a thing that happens because we cannot talk about like a universal law of the subject, but Lévi-Strauss was not very shy about talking about universal laws of prohibition of incest, for example. Or we can also see that, for example, the gift-giving structures that are so central to anthropology, they are, in a sense, universalizable, even if you have to understand this universality not as a homogeneous universality and so on. So we have this discourse that deals with intelligibility, with composition, but there is no interaction element. And I think this is a blind spot that is not, this is not a blind spot that's there by chance. If we took into account the history of anthropology, the problem that anthropologists have is the problem of going native. Like, if you are an anthropologist and you lose your place, you also lose your field because there is a structural difference that is important to the structuring of this discourse. So, and this is actually one of the things that I think a new wave of anthropology has been dealing with in the recent decades, which is the figure of the militant anthropologist. This is something I think that has not been stabilized into the field yet. I think there are various attempts. I wish Thiago was here because he could help me pinpoint them a bit better. But one thing we can say is that there is historically a blind spot in anthropology, and I'm taking ethnography and anthropology in a sense as the same interchangeable word. But the thing, there's a blind spot in regards to the interactive elements of this discourse. Because, for example, this discourse is not aimed at what it is made out of, in a sense. The anthropological discourse, it's generally aimed at another one. So it's a discourse that makes intelligibility with composition, but blinds interactive elements of this organizational field. And the last element of this first attempt at structuring these differences, we would have the political conjecture, I don't know how to say this in English, but in Portuguese, it's just análise de conjuntura. But it's like the text where they do an analysis of the situation, where they try and map the field, etc. Like, when we were initially doing this diagram, we did not differentiate, for example, on the text of Marx, but this will be done in a second moment. But when we take into account the political conjecture, there is an attempt to make visible certain differences, and there is also an attempt to make a difference through this discursive practice, just like psychoanalysis is also trying to make a difference in its discursive elaboration. So there is the principle of interaction in the sense that it is in a certain sense homogeneous to what it's going to affect. It is also a discursive practice that is preoccupied with making the relevant differences visible, but and this is, I think, oh, it's good that Gabriel is just entering right now because he can help me with this if in case needed. But this last type of discourse, there is a blind spot in the matter of composition. And I think I'm not very well versed in this, so you can forgive me, please, if I'm saying things that are clearly wrong. But for example, I was thinking about the differences between, for example, Marxists, Leninists, and Maoist forms of dealing with the problem of composition. I mean, for example, for Lenin, the idea that there is a natural movement between a proletarian and a revolutionary, this is not a continuous movement. This has to be worked out. So in a sense, the compositional element will not be as clearly defined in political analysis as it is in the other types of discourse. But like I said, this was a first attempt to try and see if there were discursive practices, types of description that would interest us, what they would show, what they would hide, how they would interact, so we could try and see what we could borrow from to build our own types of descriptions. This was like the idea behind this first attempt. After this attempt, let me go to another page. This one is a bit, this is in Portuguese, but as you can see, I've changed all the text, and I'm glad Felipe is here. This was all stuff we worked out together in a meeting to talk about some of his ideas he's working out in his PhD. And we came to the conclusion that we can sort Marx's own works in these three types of practices that have, in a sense, a blind spot and which are connected to two of the poles in their development. And for example, if we take into account a book such as, if we take into account 18th Brumaire and the Communist Manifesto, for example, they are texts that are, in a sense, an attempt to engage directly into a political action of sorts. We could say they are attempting to affect something, whereas Capital, and this might be a problem with my reading of Capital, so this might be my problem. Capital is a book for me which is extremely non-interventionist in a direct sense. I mean, people can say all they want about how, oh, this is a book to be read by workers, and of course it is. I mean, Althusser has that whole shtick about how everyone can read this book if they only skip the first 4 chapters. But besides that shtick, even if people do read Capital, I do not think it's a work that is aimed directly at doing an intervention in the political sense. I mean, I think there's an analytical framework that is connected to political questions, but there are, for example, no cries for mobilizing like we have in the Communist Manifesto. And we do not have also cries they're not really cries in the 18th Brumaire, but there is also no attempt to organize the current conjuncture as we have in the 18th Brumaire. I think in Capital, in a sense, it seems that we have something which is kind of like the intelligibilization of a field through the working out of its parts. I mean, so we have the element of composition, and we also have the element of intelligibility, because it works out which differences are relevant. But for example, one thing that we can say of Capital, which is, I think, something that is left unsaid in a sense, well, not completely unsaid. I mean, it's a huge book. And after talking to Gabriel, we actually ended up thinking that maybe Capital is a problem because it actually does everything in a certain sense. It's a mixture of modes of description. So, I mean, we could do this. We could go on and on about how to redescribe these things. And maybe that's why I feel a bit unsafe about these things. But if you take into account Capital, there is, for example, there's not a really clear difference between militants and workers. It seems that Capital works by trying to make the differences that are relevant there are not, well, these guys are potential communists and this is who I'm addressing, or these guys are people who were involved in sorry, people who are involved in political acts. No, Capital, I mean, even if there is a bit of discussion in regards to fighting against the factory, against the exploitation of the worker, even if there's that, I don't think it's easy to say straightforwardly that this book is addressed to the militant in the same manner that the Communist Manifesto is directed at militants and is directed at, and this is, I think, a point where the element of interaction is more clear. It isn't the Communist Manifesto is not, for example, directed at workers in general as Capital. It is directed at people who are in a sense already in the field as militants. So we could say maybe that the interactive element in the Communist Manifesto is present in its addressing form. And it addresses by trying to compose, I think, in a sense, a certain class of a certain class, which is the proletariat. This is, I think, the analytical work that we find there is the composition of this story. But if we take into account, for example, I mean, and this is just like me, I'm completely improvising here because this is like I said, this was a meeting to work out things more openly. The Communist Manifesto, and I think we can see this in its like vulgar historicization or vulgar history that it employs. It is not, it does have an intelligibility element there, but when we see people trying to crystallize the descriptions there into a general history of class, it normally turns out really bad. I mean, we get things like a march of historical materialism, where historical materialism is like this, it's like the social version of the long chain of being. So I don't think, for example, that the Communist Manifesto has this element of intelligibility in the same way, for example, as the 18th Brumaire, which is a book that tries to do something in the public sphere, for example, trying to rewrite history, and we could say, who is this addressed to? Is this addressed to historians? Is this addressed to people who are facing this conjuncture? But I think there's an element of interaction, and that works by trying to make the differences in the social field relevant. John, what did you say? If you could say a bit, John.
Sure, yeah. I really like all this, and I totally agree with it too. I would just argue against the idea that the misreadings, I mean, there are just tons of awful Orthodox readings of 18th of Brumaire and like, whereas I do think, and actually Gabriel's reading, I think points to this, like there is a core intelligibility of the Communist Manifesto, but what it's making intelligible is precisely the position of the communist. It's not trying to render intelligible, relations of forces, clashes, and do conjunctural analysis like 18th of Brumaire or the overall composition. It's very much trying to clarify to a new social entity called the communist what you are. Like, here you are, you're this thing. So, but I do think, like, if you look at the ways that the First International was being built, and I do think more so the First International than the Second International, and like components of the Bolshevik Party, especially as they were trying to be elaborated by Lenin in Letter to a Comrade, where he really talks about like trying to bring together heterogeneity at the bottom level by like bringing as much information from workers around Russia as possible, and really making the internal organizing principles of the party built around listening to what's happening on the ground, and everything that is kind of like the composition of forces, which I think could be more that side, is really determined by the party based upon its real interactions on the ground. And there's something to me that's much closer, but also where precisely that that same paradox comes up within. Can you go back to the other diagram for a second?
Sure.
Your precise terms. So yeah, exactly. Like the psychoanalytic paradox, like it's the transmissibility, precisely like I was talking a bit with this about this with Gabrielle earlier this week. It becomes precisely the transmissibility of being someone like Lenin, the various leader functions that get coagulated into a person. That becomes in many ways the problems of the party, the so-called heirs to Lenin, the splits that form precisely around that become like, how do you transmit what it means to be a good fucking communist, right? What does it mean to be a communist? How do you transmit that as a practice? So yeah, those are the kind of, that's what I'm trying to say in that comment.
No, I think that's excellent, because if you think about it, the transmission problem of what it is to be a communist is like, this is not to get to change too much the topic, but this is something that I've been thinking about since reading Robert Linhart's, I don't know how it's called in English. It's like The Factory and the Worker. I don't know what it's, but because there's a different name in Portuguese, in French, and in English. But it's the book about the guy, the French Maoist, who stays a year in the factory. And then there's a strike or something that he helps organize. And
the assembly line.
The assembly line. I mean, I wanted to do an analysis that is directed at the choice of translation for each of these words. I mean, I think it's very telling what is, I wanted to do some vulgar anthropology by these translation choices. The fact that the assembly line is what is chosen, because, I mean, for people who read the book, the assembly line it's really one of the most expressive, I think, descriptions in literature of how an assembly line is actually composed, and how it's very, at the same time, very modern, but also very prehistoric. And it's wonderful, wonderfully horrible. But one thing that I was reading in the book that really got to me, which is, I think, in the problem that you were saying, John, is that in a sense I was asking myself, like, what is this book for? I mean, what does this do? because in a sense it describes the life. You could say, oh, it's just like it describes the life of someone who would be in a factory and who would try to jumpstart the revolution, and like all Maoists, they failed because Maoism is a bad thing, etc. But what I was thinking is because there is something that is transmitted in that type of book that led me to think like, what is it? How should I say, like, what are we sharing when we are sharing our attempts to describe the social order? And in a sense, I think that book it transmits something. And I think I'm being a bit mystical here, because I always think of Socrates' attempt to teach Meno virtue. There's a moment in the book where they say there is no transmission that is possible. That is the aim of the book, to show that teaching the virtue is not possible. But then Socrates ends the dialogue. It's like, it's literally the last thing he says. Meno, you will do to, like, I don't know, Anytus, I don't know what his name is. It's something like that. You will do to Anytus what I did to you. So in a sense, he transmits virtue to Meno, but he does not transmit it in a positive sense. Like, it's not this is what being a communist is like. You have to do this, you have to do that. So this is something that is in my mind while I'm trying to work. And I think when you talk about the internal documents, I think I thought that was, I'm sorry for being so long-winded, but I thought it reminded me of this issue, because I think this is what is at heart. How do you transmit this problem? It is not simply by amassing multitudes of documents in this sense. So let me continue. So this would be what it would be, internal documents.
And you know, the critique of the Gotha project would be in between the capital and the documents, probably.
Like here? No, like here.
Like here.
Oh, because it's a public document.
Yeah, it's a theoretical critique of an organizational document, right?
Yeah. This like seems like one of the literary genres invented by Borges. We are going to do a scientific critique of a. I think that's good. I cannot draw it, but I'll do this. Wait. Oh, I'm not so savvy. So just so I can do this. Okay, I'll do this shit later. Well, besides
I'd also
that,
say that, sorry, I think also if you want to be very, very picky, I'd say you could also put on the other side of the Gotha project, here, if you will, Marx's letters to Vera Zasulich, where they discuss whether it's possible to have like a different path for, you know, development of communism through communal properties in Russia and so on. But it's conjuncture analysis of Russian situation, but it's also very kind of central to a theory of history. It's not just like analysis of. So I don't know, just, I don't think that's relevant. I'm just trying to think like if we could also add like combined.
I think they would be like, if we talk about they would be like not only the circle, but they would be like the how do you say this? They would be like two circles in the same color, for example. Like, is that what you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, just in
Like,
the sense that you could think also the composites, right? Of
Yeah,
each of these
yeah.
two.
Of-
But
oh,
yeah,
yeah,
but
of-
I don't think it's so relevant to the point.
Yeah, I think the point, and this is like something that became clear to me. Oh, this is something that I also tried, which is trying to see how each of these texts deals with a different logic. For example, if you have a text like capital, we have the force logic and the dual power logic. Why did I put the dual power logic there? I wrote this so I wouldn't forget. Oh yes, because there's the problem of the identity of the worker. So it's working in these two elements. And there is, I don't think there is so strong in capital as in other texts, a theory, there isn't a theory of the states explicitly there that is elaborated and that would allow for the insurrectionist logic to come in. While, for example, in the text like 18th Brumaire, you would have a text that is dealing with the force logic because it's a matter of the capitalists, the different forces of capitalism, and also trying to understand the elements of state logic and how insurrections, the place for insurrections in that field. And the Communist Manifesto, maybe this doesn't make sense, but I was thinking later that what seemed more like the mix of insurrectionist and dual power logic was not the Communist Manifesto, but was the Maoist inquiry, because it's an inquiry which, in a sense, this is something that I was working after our meeting with Marcelo. During the meeting, actually, the Maoist immersive inquiry, it attempts at the same time, and this is something that I found very, 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 very interesting. The Maoists, they are trying to map a terrain of conflicts. So they are not always like, they're not necessarily trying to deal with economic inequalities like immediately. They are simply trying to map the social terrain. And this means, and we see this by their practice, on the conclusion that Mao, he gets to the conclusion that we have these, like the people from the, I don't know, Camponeses, the peasants. The peasants, we can either, like he says in his report, that you can either oppose the peasants and then you will be crushed. You can not follow the peasants and then you will be lagging behind, or you can join the peasants and be a sort of a vanguard for the peasants. And I think, in a sense, there is, in this Maoist immersive inquiry, they deal a lot, I think, with the dual power logic, which puts things, I think, in the terrain of affinity problems, in the gift-giving problems. But at the same time, there is the political element is not, there's a, I would say there is a certain blind spot, at least at this level, to the economic forces at hand, I think. This may be short-sighted by my part, but sorry. But I was thinking that there is the Maoist inquiry, at least from the descriptions in Marcelo's book, it seems to be more concerned with these two elements. Whereas if you take, for example, the Leninist statistical inquiry, which is something that is done not in the relation to the workers, peasants, or whatever, but through statistics and through the analysis of paperwork, etc., the logic of affinities is, in a sense, it seems lacking. So in a sense, what I figured is that you have the explanation, in a sense, for why the party occupies such a space in this structure. While if you take the Marxist questionnaire into account, it is a matter of naming names and also in positioning the worker in the field in the economic field. Please, John.
I'm wondering if, like, if we zoom into any given period, and I'm most familiar with the history of the Russian, like if we could look at things like what at the time was a very sensible emphasis on newspapers, even if it's become absurd in certain cases nowadays. But back then, having a newspaper was a main source of transmission. In a lot of ways, that kind of picked up the force logic and dual power logic and kind of translated the questionnaire into like an institutional form, I think. And the internal documents of the party and letters written in, reports written in, there's a ton of factory exposures and whatnot by the party. That seems like it could be similar to kind of like immersive inquiry as well. So it seems like we can kind of look at which chapters of Marxist history were best at which, and we can also kind of potentially see how any given structure, since that in order to be effective, you have to deal with all three dimensions. So everyone is going to have some kind of discourse, and we can kind of also recover weaker forms of that, right? Like maybe the paper wasn't as strong as some of the earlier things, or maybe the ways of doing immersive inquiry didn't really unveil key dimensions like the later ones would, but we can kind of see different aspects at each synchronic stage as well, like play out.
I think what you said is like it really gets to the place where I wouldn't say I'm there already. I think you have arrived before me. But I think the point is this. The first point you said is perfect, which is, I think, whichever space you zoom in or you zoom out, you will be able to highlight different elements that seem better taken care of or not. For example, this is an impression that I get, but the immersive inquiry and this is, I think, something, now that I think about it, there's I think this would need further developing. But for example, the problem of nation, of the imaginary unity, of the logic of affinities, there are many solutions to this problem, and we will see different, and I think the case of China and Russia is very good, because they're both very multi-language, multi-national, multi-ethnic in a sense. So there are very different solutions into how to produce these unities, and how to and I think this is the thing, the form that you will try and produce this unity, the form of the inquiry, will, in a sense, give you different forms of homogenization. This is something that, and I do think that when you do the zoom ins to the different forms of inquiry, and this is I think something that I'm not really set on, like what is the point of this? Do we just like see what practices are useful, and we try to compose our way according to our situations, according to what our to our predicaments, or is there a sense in which we have to develop tools that are, or not develop, but take into account the tools that we have at our disposals for accounting for these differences that we need to compose? Because, like you said, it's not a matter of choosing. I mean, especially in both cases, in the case of the types of inquiry and the logics of resistance, but also in the case, and this is I think what I showed you guys in the meeting with Marcelo, in the case of the Trinitarian organizational principle, because there are different, I think, effects you can have depending on the type of inquiry. But this is something that I'm really not set, but I think that would be useful to understand, and this is, I think, why I scheduled this meeting, if we are interested in doing case studies. Because when we do case studies, we will have to start somewhere when trying to define not only what will we investigate, I mean, which are the groups, how will we delimit them, but also in the sense that the different forms of inquiry imply in different products. I mean, they will show us different things. So this is something that I think somehow we have to take into account. Not really sure how. I'm just struggling not to drown here. Yeah, you go ahead, Gabriel.
Yeah, so yeah, I think that things become a bit clearer when we think about like the more practical task, right? I think that a couple of months ago, we raised the issue of, well, one of the possible ways we can start putting to test, kind of investigating the consequences of the work we've been doing is through a sort of filtering or engagement with militant experiences from different political processes, right? And the first thing I understand that you're doing in a certain sense is saying, okay, but we, from our own theoretical point of view, depending on how you approach this, you will interact with different aspects of different political processes, right? So, for example, if we start looking at like bringing kind of sociologists of the left who give us a sort of broad perspective on tendencies, composition, what we get to know about, you know, is our political movements composed mostly by middle class, working class people, so on and so forth. You get this kind of statistical inquiry. There's a tendency that you will automatically privilege some type of, some things will appear to us, right? So, and if we do something slightly different, more ethnographical about the relations between militants and something else will appear. So I have the impression that the tools you're constructing here, they have to do with this preliminary kind of, okay, we want to go in that direction. So if we just apply the stuff we're studying to the method through which we want to engage with people, we already get some interesting new problems. Like,
yeah.
And I feel like it's already, like, there are two things that I find very interesting in what you're doing. One is, I think it clarifies that probably we need kind of a method that is, you know, different to each thing we do. I mean, it doesn't seem like we should simply pose the question of what does it mean to integrate these three things in one rather than 2 by 2. Right, so I think it's, let's say, giving more credence that there are many ways of doing this, because ultimately there's no other way other than emphasizing more this than that and so on, right? I would even say that when you have the three things, it's not an inquiry that has any sort of externality. It's just being in an organization. Like, yeah, you want to know about a political process in a way that these three things are entangled perfectly. Yeah, that's called, you know, being in that movement. So
yeah, I think that's good.
So perhaps the first reason why you never get the three together, it's because we're already questioning what it means to be different types of strangers in politics.
Yeah.
Because if you're not a stranger, you're just in the process, of course, right? So
yeah.
So that might clarify there. And I think that that comes to the second point, which I really like, which is in this particular diagram you drew, you did something we never did with this triangle, which is to suggest a kind of unity at a different scale, right? So it's not that, for example, Marx's questionnaire doesn't produce an idea of composition, right? It's just that it happens at a slightly different level than the movement itself. Like you're questioning workers, you're sending them the questionnaires, getting them back, so on and so forth. But that interaction and what it makes intelligible is not producing a composition of you with those workers, but it might serve to a composition at a different scale where the international, for example, will now consider the workers in a new way when it thinks about its own composition, right? So there is composition, but in a way that's slightly exterior to the place of inquiry, right? And similarly with the Maoist kind of convivial, immersive inquiries, there is an interaction in a composition together, but there is a strangeness, which is, I mean, you need Mao's red book. It's not immanent. Everyone needs to have the intelligibility principle as something which is slightly detached, right? So I think that fits really well with that insight we had when we were talking to Marcelo, that there are inquiries because there can be no meetings, right? If you were just meeting people as part of the organizations, you wouldn't need inquiries. You'd just be an activist among activists. Is the fact that parts of movements are stranger to other parts of movements because it's just too many people doing too many things in parallel that introduces this detachment, right? So I have the impression that what you did really kind of clarifies this and puts it to work in a way. So I wanted to hear what you guys think of this, and also, yeah, I think that there is one thing, last thing that is important is just that I think that when you think of inquiries in terms of an extension of meetings, like I cannot be there, I cannot be part of this, but I still want to be interdependent with it, right? I think this is the original choice of what this means. If inquiries are sociological, then you're not a stranger that is still inside. You're like a sociologist. You can be an amateur sociologist of something which is other to you. So you don't need to, like, you want to know about it, but there is no other kind of results that is needed. There's nothing that needs to aggregate as we go on, right? But if inquiries are a continuation of meetings, inquiries exist because meetings are impossible, then there's something about meetings, which is the interdependence amongst the people involved, the creation of bonds, and so on, that we also want the inquiries to establish beyond the knowledge claim, right? So I think that there is this, like this theory of, okay, it's detached, that's why there's inquiry, but then you have a basic choice, like, but are you then outside? Or can this still live up to some additional constraints, like no inquiry that does not kind of leave a mark on both parts, you know? Or no inquiry that doesn't create some level of new dependence between the inquirer, people inquiring, the people who are producing some sort of, who are the authors of this inquiry, right? That closes the detachment a bit, right? So I think that's a way to start thinking about this as well.
Just before I give you for you, John, just one thing. I think this really cleared up something for me, which is the blind spot element and the productive element. They are at the same time, at the same place, but they are at different levels. So for example, we can talk about, one of the things I started saying, just get back to this, that the psychoanalytical discourse, it was between composition and interaction. And there is, in a sense, a blind spot, which is the transmission of the truth of the subject, or whatever we want to say that psychoanalysis transmits, its lack of universality or whatever. But if we take into account the last diagram, and actually these diagrams, they are all composed sequentially. So there is an order of the idea got clear as I tried doing more. We could say that, for example, there is intelligibility in the psychoanalytical discourse, which is its very own blind spot, but it is an intelligibility in another level from that practice. And the same thing applies, for example, to anthropology. You cannot affect the people who you are discussing. There is the taboo that you may not go native, but there is an interaction that is produced at another level, which is normally seized at the state's interest, the colonial power's interest. And the whole thing about anthropology currently, I think, is trying to make this interaction not be at the interest only of the colonial powers. But getting back to this, I think this clears something for me, because there is a choice of what to subtract, what you will subtract, that in a sense will produce something, a connection at another level, maybe a connection in the sense of the extension of the meeting. I think what is, and it involves, I think, uncovering in an organization what is missing, because, for example, some organizations, they will not have the problem of this is might seem like simple, I think, but if you have a social field where the division between workers and capitalists is clear and transparent, this is not something that you need to establish through the inquiry. You will need to establish other things. For example, why are these workers not working, not mobilizing, not involved in the militants, etc. But for example, if we take into account the situation, like we could say, if we take a vulgar neoliberalism discourse, which is to say, like, that vulgarization of Foucault, everyone is a what is it called? Empresário de si. Everyone is a
Entrepreneur.
Self-entrepreneur. Well, that is a social field where you have to establish some differences. And the Marxist inquiry, for example, it would be interesting to get to produce those effects on people. Like, you don't even know you are a worker, so this needs to be produced in a sense so we can extend. I know I'm riffing off, but John, please.
I mean, that's great riffing, so it's all good. I want to second, like, a lot of Gabriel's responses in the direction of, like, what this means kind of in practice. And I think, like, one thing, I guess, like, to start with would just be like that experience of when you read something and it's not satisfying. It's not, like, it doesn't get the job done politically and helping. And I think that be like that, you know, I think in a lot of contexts that can just be a critical question, but in organizing context, it really becomes a political question insofar as what happens when you're dissatisfied with your comrades' work. What happens when you have to actually talk about getting better at things and you're not the person. It's easy when it's yourself, because in a lot of ways, but it's a much bigger question when you've got critiques of other people and organizations. And it's, I think, one of those places where without methods, without frameworks, and without something that's somewhat impersonal to help adjudicate, it can quickly devolve in some of the worst petty nonsense or become a pretext for other petty nonsense, right? And suddenly someone's work that was just fine doesn't become or whatever, right? And so I think in one sense, like, a framework like this helps to impersonalize and even institutionalize what it means to do good work, and to kind of, I can easily imagine how we could start to build out of this through education and through, like, you know, just like a writing workshop or something, what this starts to look like in practice and how this can actually become a pedagogical thing. How can people become better writers, better analysts, better composers of internal documents? And it can become something that can really help build up skills. Because again, one of those places where leadership functions tend to concentrate are in writing skills, are in things that are very much, like, inaccessible for all the reasons. And a lot of times, like, these methods are limited to who gets to go to school or who gets to blah, blah, blah. And there's something about this that I think can really help in training and in development. And I think it also can clarify how to like organize division of labor. And I think that's something that, like, Gabriel's comments were indicating, like, to really kind of break down, on the one hand, fetishizing one thing or the other, kind of privileging one kind of media, which tends to happen in organizations, or we're going to do this as opposed to that, and just kind of really saying these are all necessary to any real ecology of politics. But also realistically, no one's going to be good at all of them or be able to do all of them or be contributing much in all of them. So what does it actually mean to then find a place to participate? Again, I feel like if this continues to resonate with people and make sense and kind of naturally gives us a topology to position text, I don't feel like we're forcing things. I feel like it kind of naturally fits. Then that strikes me as something that other people can really kind of build on and internalize and start to develop skills that are truly coming from within a political movement in a really cool way.
Can I just complement something that I said before? It's just that I think it's curious that we don't get there, that we never said it, but it's very relevant, which is, I think that most of the time we forget that, I mean, 90% of political documents are produced for specific people that you meet and never become public. Like that's the big amount of writing, right? It's precisely, I mean, written to people that you meet with, right? I would even say that perhaps like the main characteristics of political texts is that they have concrete people as addressees. Like, I mean, it's a very specific situation in which making a speech to anonymous people, that's politics. Like that's political speech. Most political speech is done with very concrete, I mean, as concrete as possible, right? The more situated you are, the more you're taking into consideration the differences of those people rather than that people, the more you're going away from abstractions and describing actual situations. So I think that at the core of this triangle, there is a type of writing or a genre of writing. I would even say perhaps is, you know, a tension between where you get to have speech, because speech and meetings go along together. The moment that you move away from meetings, it's hard to speak to people. And that's when the other becomes, you know, an enigma that you need to uncover. And then you need tools to get to the other. But so you can do that again to that thermometer of, you know, situations where you have meetings and then you have closed documents meant to, I mean, 99% of political writing is, how do you call this? Like the register of meetings, what we said, right? And so we don't forget once we're not meeting. So it's all about stitching together meetings. Like I would say, like that's the ground zero of
I think even the Communist Manifesto is in a sense that registered.
I would say it's already something slightly
You think it's no, yeah, okay, but I think it's there is a register of sorts, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, but it has something to do with that, because then you can ask a question, which is, what does it mean to have this? I mean, we have now Zoom meetings. That's the art of it, but it doesn't answer the question. But the question is, what does it mean to have complex meetings? Meaning meetings where not everyone can either be at the same place at the same time or recognize each other as part of the same meeting. You know, they're happening at like different scales. In a certain sense, there is, the left is, let's say, the set of all political meetings happening at a given time, right? You could call that like the meeting of meetings, right?
I like this. I like this.
But it's complex because it's stratified. There are people meeting in many places. Those meetings don't meet up. Trying to make that visible is not the same as inquiring what does the other think.
Yes,
right?
Please, yes.
So, but the more this composition, this kind of vertical composition is impossible, the more you need to ask a question about the other, like an impenetrable other, because what are the indigenous folks of Brazil thinking today? Like, well, it's because you never meet them that you ask that question in the form of an inquiry. If you were doing something together with those people, you wouldn't call them people, you would call them by proper names. What is this guy and that person thinking, right? It's only when meetings don't cover much of the space that this sort of detachment starts being introduced, I think. So I think it's interesting to think of this kind of, first think of inquiries as the effect of some complication at the level of meetings, which is not a problem, it's just a consequence of organizing. Michael, please go. Michael is now a renowned philosopher in Brazil.
All right. No, I just want to say that I think I disagree, because when you work at a company, for example, you don't know the other department usually. This is a real problem of organization, and you realize you realize this inquiries, this questionnaires to know other departments. I think it's a problem when you think about the size of the organization, whatever, if it's political or it's capitalist. In capitalist organizations, you have a real dictatorial, totalitarian way of managing, but I think it doesn't solve everything anyway.
But I was agreeing with you. I totally agree. My point is just that it's different to approach this as if it's moving to the other of militants, and to think of it as, exactly as you said, a problem of size. Like, you need to introduce this. Why are we introducing these concerns, right, with inquiry here? An investigation of what's going on, especially we're not even doing it in the classical sense of what are the others thinking, the people thinking, what is like the worker thinking alone. We're trying to bind this together with what does the left even think of itself?
Yeah,
right.
And I think it makes even more sense if we look at, I think the problem here is, as always, the idea, the vulgar idea of knowledge is always thought as something, in a sense, detached. But I think knowledge, maybe we can, I'm trying to let me, how do I say this, implacar this difference. I'm trying to sell a difference between knowledge and wisdom that I'm still working out. I think wisdom is, in a sense, knowledge that is addressed. But this is just like my Platonic bullshit. So you can ignore that for a bit. But if you take into account knowledge as the neutral social science, the product of a neutral science, social science, what you get is a disposition of parts where you begin by treating the other as an object. And I think one thing that really stands out from Marcelo's book is that if you take the workers' inquiry, and this is like a point that he really tries to hammer out a lot. If you take into account Marx's workers' inquiry as simply an attempt to gain knowledge of worker situation, I mean, from one point of view, this is simply just stupid, because as Lenin showed, he can get these informations from other places, and well, Marx wrote Capital. So I mean, he didn't need to. It's not something that he needs to do. I mean, he does have knowledge. He can get this from other places. But when he talks about the idea that the point is to produce an effect, this does not treat the worker as another. And this, I think, is the main problem. And this is something that I think really came to me like in a crystal clear image when I read Renzo's and Vitor's text on the workers and the militants. I mean, I think if you guys translate this text, it would be really good discussing this in the group, because I think it's very on point in many issues, especially in the problem of treating the other as another. Marx's inquiry can only make sense if he begins from treating the worker as someone who's already our own, in a sense, or else he cannot affect them. If this was simply an anthropological survey, there would be no political implications, I think. And I think the problem, and this is something that happens, I think, with all kinds of, I think this is something that was really discussed really well. I think it was a point that John and Gabriel talked in the meeting with Marcelo, which is, it makes a lot of sense that inquiry of the right is so high on the academic market. because in the academic market, what is at stake is not political in a sense. And if you treat the other as another, well, you leave yourself out of a responsibility to engage with the other, I think, in a sense. I mean, I'm moralizing a bit, but I am a Platonic philosopher, so there's that. But I do think that if you take into account, and this, I think the Maoist inquiry is really what highlighted for me, like, if you do not treat the population as already one of your own, I mean, because I think there's he extends maximally, I think, this I think is why Chinese Maoism is really interesting. If you treat everybody as a potential communist, I mean, that's, you can't like simply postulate that. But if you work out the ways of how would you extend a meeting, the leftist meetings, to include your nation, that is in itself, I think, the work of inquiry. The work of inquiry is not dealing with the other, but I think in a sense, there's this inversion, I think, that Maoism does more clearly. The peasants, they are communists already, in a sense, so that for Mao to do what he does, he has to leave from that point, I think. Not that they are communists, but I mean, and it did work out in a sense. So I think there's some knowledge here. But I don't know who's next. I think it's John.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Michael's point, because I think it does definitely bring up the main issue we're trying to deal with. But I think it's also important to politicize that distinction as well, in the sense that, like, I work at a restaurant with less than 20 employees right now, and been thinking a lot about this theory in the context of that. And one of the things that's very clear when we look at how organizing spaces is the way that a certain kind of authoritarianism, even at this tiny scale, is at play, a certain kind of patriarchic relations that already divide up staff amongst each other. And that's very much a product, not of like inherent emergence of like complexity, but like of a very like decades long way that my boss has kept that space organized. And when you zoom up to like big corporations, like internal communications at the IT level are just manufactured in a way to make it very difficult for staff to interact with each other. And again, that's not an emergent quality. That isn't something, that's a deliberate design decision that was implemented. I think like if you look at the corporate level, you can look at certain things like business units, which is a way that like super big corporations kind of break up different regions or different like sub products. That is a kind of organic way that scale is dealt with by corporations, simply because they do become too big. But if you zoom into the way like different departments are separated on like a local level, like for example, one of the big corporations I worked to, us techs were on a bottom level and all the engineers and salespeople were on the top floor. And it was just weird to go upstairs, like you stuck out. Like there was a built-in design that didn't have to be that way. That was very much a design decision for political purposes from the management down. And I think part of what our theory enables us to do is to distinguish those places that are more organically emergent in terms of scale, like business units, from things that are very much politically implemented and have to be kind of like called out as such because they occur at the smallest bullshit little fry burger restaurant like I'm working at right now, all the way up to top telecom companies.
I think it's Vitor now.
I think I think the model is very, very interesting, and I think what Gabriel said, that the Communist Manifesto was written for the League of Communists, specifically to intervene in a specific context with a specific group. It was not to the whole of the proletariat, as it claims to be. However, it gained a level of universality in the manner it handled the particularities of the conjecture. So I think there is a deliberate effort from Marx to try to turn these particular struggles part of something greater that can become a social revolution that will emancipate all humans and etc., etc., etc. So I think that's my first point. So I think the inquiry aspect of the militancy always has that intention implied. Out of that experience of struggle or work or whatever, we are trying to derive lessons that will help us fight capitalism as a system. And I agree with John in the sense that the bosses also do inquiries all the time. They employ spies, they employ private investigators, they employ iFood, for example, hired an academic institute to do an ethnography on 2,000 delivery workers to see what they felt about the work they do, and that guided their management and political strategies to fight the courier movements. So in a sense, I think we have to first realize that it is not one-sided. It is not only the academy and leftists who are interested in what workers are thinking, doing, feeling, how they relate. The workers, the bosses, the managers, and the military, and they are also interested, and they are doing research, and they are participating and living with people and making friendships and all of that we do to try and understand and gain political power too. So I think since I'm not sure if how it is in America, but in Brazil, the left is heavily located in university. So people tend to see themselves not as proletarians, but as researchers. Even when they are doing workers' inquiry, they see not the workers producing knowledge for themselves and for fellow workers, but as a third subject, separated from the conflict. They are intervening. But the fact is, when you are a journalist and you participate, like I did, in the organization of a courier group, you are not a third party. You are with the couriers as a subject, producing knowledge with them and against them too. The knowledge you produce will be used by the bosses to disorganize them also. And we have, I think, to be maybe I don't know. I think there is something of a very difficult problem to solve with the notion of the militant, the worker and the militant. The militant struggles, the worker survives. Everyone struggles. The militant treats the way he survives differently from the way other workers treat the way they survive. I think it is more of a cognitive difference than a practical one. We every worker, like that book of the working class, every worker is obligated to recur to collective relationships to survive. Every worker, every single one of them, every single one of them. So maybe the problem with the militant inquiry and the deficiencies and the blind spots of this perspective is the problem that Sam Moss that I've linked here cites. A group of workers isolates itself from the rest of the workers, and it's sort of a and we don't know what to do about that. We just don't know. We do not connect social reproduction to anti-capitalist struggle. But that should be the starting point, the principle of the thing. We should fight against capitalism to survive in better terms, to get better wages, etc., etc. So why doesn't that happen? I think that's why an inquiry could help. It could help understand why do anti-capitalist struggles do not become conscious of themselves as anti-capitalist struggles and do not go further than do not go further. That's it. I have to think a bit more.
Felipe.
Hi. I think it's like the first time that I'm talking, so it's a pleasure of like attending this group and all the meetings, and also to appreciate like the Rafael presentations today. I think it's a very useful diagram for us to think about political organization, but I have like a more like a commentary and a sort of a question, but when Gabriel and Rafael were discussing the relation between the type of inquiry we need to do like in our political practice, and I have like some I don't know if like some bullshit questions about it, or if like a lot of triviality or vulgar questions, but I don't see really how the relation between the intelligibility and the interaction can be framed as a relation that can be addressed by a sort of inquiry. And I think when Rafael was talking about the difference between wisdom and knowledge, I think there are some useful insights there. Why? Because if you remind when Marx is writing about the class struggles of 1848, he has like some famous quotations when he says like when a class is acting as a class, like self-conscious of its own interests, this class does not need to do like theoretical investigations of what are they tasked to make revolution. So I know it's like a pretty obvious point, but I think that's very interesting. It's like if you want to act as a class, like in the political sphere, you don't have like to make I don't know theoretical investigations. And I think that's connected to a Marxist thesis that's like truth is not theoretical truth, but it's truth is like practical truth. So we can frame that and the relation between knowledge and wisdom, because wisdom for the Greeks in general, not only for Plato, but also for Aristotle, is like is a matter of like practical wisdom, or is like a kind of knowledge that is not directed to theoretical interests. So I think that when we are talking about the model of an inquirer, we are talking about every time we talk about an inquirer, we're talking about a theoretical knowledge. But I think that the type of knowledge that it's like has some interest to the relation between intelligibility and the interaction is a kind of practical knowledge, a kind of practical wisdom. So you don't like if you want to have some good insight of Marx trying to tell us when he says that a class, when it's acting as a class, does not make like theoretical investigation for about his their own interests. I think that can be linked to the idea that we learn our interests. We know like we have to do. We know what our tasks are, like joining a political organization, like because if I think that was Graybill that said whenever you're like in a communist party, in a political organization, you know what you have to do. You know collective what you have to do. You don't have like to make theoretical investigations. You think through your own practice. So I think that the blind spot here is not a blind spot that can be like assessed or even addressed by like speculative questions or even theoretical questions, but it's like a kind of knowledge that you only have access to make those questions once you are like in a political organization. I don't know if that's clear, if that makes any sense, but I think that's a good side of the topic, because and also to make an observation, I think that's one of the main defects of the left, at least in Brazil today, is that we think like some theoreticians or some intellectual can like, I don't know, give us some theoretical insight on the questions of what we have to do. But the questions like what we have to do is not intended to be like a theoretical questions. These questions, like when Lenin make these questions, is like to be a practical questions, a question to be discussed by militants. So yeah, I see the connection. Well, we have like to make like a inquiry to know what how workers are composed, how workers are distributed in the society and so on. But the kind of knowledge we obtain for this kind of inquiry, I don't maybe I like misunderstand the point, but I don't see how like an inquiry can help like this relation between intelligibility and interaction. So it's like just a question.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was unmuted. Just before I pass it on to Gabriel, I think there's one point that is important to clear, is that I don't think intelligibility here is, it's I don't know if I understood completely your question, but I do think, for example, and I really did like this point that Gabriel made earlier about the fact that 99% of political texts are internal in a sense. They are always addressed to someone, and that they are not how should I say, a political discussion that happens in the public sphere, as if we are all intellectuals that are like discussing what is to be done in a vague way. And it's actually very funny. It's funny, at least to me, because I hate this guy. But it's very funny that Gabriel and Paraná's book about the fractures of the left, it came out like a few months later. There is like this Arendtian version. I'm not here saying I'm pro Hannah Arendt or against. I'm just saying like that there's this whole political sphere shtick that the name of the book is the Possible Dialogue, and it's about the fracture of the public sphere in Brazil. And I think it's I really would like to read that book together with the I don't know, spiky architecture. I don't know how you guys translate the book into English. I think there's a word.
Spiky
that-
architecture is cool.
Okay. Because I do think, in a sense, the distinction that we are aiming is exactly one that the intelligibility that we are trying to account is not the one that is discussed in the public sphere, because the discussion in the public sphere, in a sense, it goes towards, I think, that neutral theoretical knowledge, which is, in a sense, a bit worthless. I mean, so I really was thinking about intelligibility, and this is something that I still have to finish the transcription, and I'm saying finish, I did like 10% of it, but I still have to finish the transcription of Renzo's excellent presentation on the elements of political economy, of social struggle, about the school occupations in São Paulo, because I really think that there is in that presentation an exercise of what intelligibility is in the sense that we are grasping at. It is not, it is a discourse, because, I mean, let me be, maybe I'll be a bit stupid, but I think this makes sense. If you are like, I mean, everybody's had, I mean, I hope not everybody, but I mean, most people have had troubles with their financial status. And maybe some of you guys, one day you opened up a spreadsheet and you thought, fuck it, I need to account for everything I did. And maybe this is stupid what I'm going to say, but I think it's in a sense where interaction and intelligibility, they are accounted for, because you are seeing what in your actions is, in a sense, you are seeing what are you spending too much on, what is not a problem, etc. And in a sense, it's a move that makes a difference sensible, and it also affects a difference, because I mean, it's not, I mean, it doesn't make a difference for everyone, but for many people, you will be horrified. Oh, fuck it, I spent too much money on iFood or whatever, and you will stop spending money on that. And of course, this can't be applied, like, it's not all differences will be just a matter of accounting your financial expenditure. But I think it's a stupid example of how intelligibility and interaction can be composed, how you can deal with them at the same time. And it's not even something that's universal. I mean, you're not going to solve everyone's problems, but you are going to highlight some differences. So I think it's a bit different than, for example, what I do think we have too much, we did spend too much time dissing the tankies. I don't know what Vitor is talking about, but I think that's true. But the tankies, they deserve it in a sense. So, I mean, I'm split on this. But they are right and wrong at the same time. We should all become Maoists. I think that's the solution. But like I was saying, I do think that when we try and make this decision, and actually this, I thank you all a lot for what you guys are saying, because this is really clearing up something that's really important to me, which is the fact that whatever is, however this inquiry is produced, it is very important to have the question of the address and the concreteness of the situation at hand, because truly this is no, because if what matters is the idea of transmitting something, you cannot transmit something to a public sphere. I mean, if you transmit something to a public sphere, you are only transmitting a knowledge that will be like an abstract knowledge that will have no worth. And it's very good for your career as an influencer or as a public intellectual. But I mean, we can look at how public intellectuals fare. Marx is a prime example of this, I think. He was a public intellectual in a sense, but he was also like one of the most, he wrote a lot in a situated manner. I mean, this man will literally write the whole history of mankind in private letters before going to therapy. But I do think there's an insight that we know when something is relevant, because this is the point of intelligibility. And I do think there's a difference between intelligibility that we have to account, intelligibility for an individual and intelligibility for an organization. And I'll just, before I'm talking too much, but just before I leave, I'll do this with one example I have, because I've only participated, this is like my guilt. I've only participated in my life in one organization. It was, well, I'm honored of that. It was a failed organization, like all leftist organizations tend to be. So I think that makes me a part of the left. But we struggled in many ways. But I think there was these situations. There was one type of situation where we could account for what we were trying to do. And it was in a sense where we were trying to organize what the financial distribution of the money in our organization, what it would be aimed at. Because at those moments, it was very clear, not at a personal level, like what this organization meant to us, but what was relevant for the working of the organization itself. And in a sense, it framed our failure, framed in a good way, in the sense that we were able to have a clear picture on what was the truth of our organization, if I can be a bit platonic. And in a sense, I think intelligibility, it makes sense, and I'm seeing that at this level, not necessarily. I mean, the financial, personal finance. I think it's a good example, but I think this other example is it's a type of information that we devised and developed after. It wasn't something that existed from the beginning. It was something that developed through our own not understanding exactly what we were about. And of course, it was a decision. We could have been other things also. But once it was framed, there was a path. We had a certain sense. And I think it's at that level that this intelligibility and the interaction may affect. Okay, Gabriel, sorry. I was just going to make a small remark, but as always.
No, but it's perfect. Felipe, that Rafael kind of anticipated what I was going to say. I think that I totally agree with what Vitor said. In fact, I think that's for me, because that was at the origin of our project, right? I think that a lot of the stuff we're developing here is an attempt to answer the question, how would leftist theory look if you didn't presuppose that militants and workers are separate people? Therefore, critique of political economy is one thing, organizational theory is another. We start from very, very, very early on saying, let's rebuild everything from the standpoint that there is just organization. So when you start from that, everything looks slightly different. And I think that it hones now, it brings us closer to exactly the problem Vitor mentioned, which I think frames exactly the distinction you made between theory and know-how. Because, I mean, I'm an analyst to a lot of people who are definitely not militants, who are, quite paradigmatic contemporary workers, and they do a lot of theory. I mean, they have models of the reality as a whole, which play the exact same role that theory plays to me. On the one hand, it tells them where they are in something bigger than themselves. And on the other hand, it also helps them to tell them who they are. So on the one hand, it's saying, yeah, okay, the terrain is like this. These people are vagabonds, like vagabundo. These people are good people. I'm allowed to do this because of these big reasons. I'm not allowed to do that. And it's also done in such a way that they know who they are. Like, this is where I stand. Like, this is exactly how theory functions for us, telling us here that we're part of something cool and very big, but also telling us we're on the right side of history or whatever. And I think that that's also the reason why I like the term thinking more than the term theory or the term know-how. Theory seems like it has no immediate practical effect. It's already universal. And know-how seems like it exhausts itself in the practical effect. Whereas thinking, I think, goes straight. I mean, you can derive these three terms we're using from the idea of thinking. When you're thinking something, you are looking at the matter at hand, what things are in front of you, meaning what is there, a composition. There's, a problem made of some food you need to cook, right? You can act in certain ways with it. And some things are relevant to that interaction. And the relevant things, if it is a matter of thinking, it's not going to exhaust itself in that context, right? I would say, like, to say that everyone thinks is to say that everyone deals with problems in such a way that there is something that goes beyond the context in which they're solving the problem. I think that's the paradigmatic claim. If you think other people think, you think that whatever they do to solve their problems of survival might be useful in other situations because they are connected to something else, right? Possibly. So I think thinking, though it has like this philosophical connotation of something profound, I think it's a really good term to like bring together this kind of universalizing tendency and the very practical aspect of know-how that you emphasize, which I totally agree with. So I think of what Victor said, which is really crucial, even to the framing of these problems, right? If you take this as a continuum, like on the one hand of the thermometer of the specter, you have when we use concepts, names, representations to help us do something we wouldn't do alone. Like if I just think of my house, of the food I buy, I don't think about climate change. I need this name. And suddenly once I introduce that name, I also introduce a bunch of commitments that will keep me from doing some things and will lead me to do other things. It's like I'm acting in a bigger world, right? So the theory is like making you act on a bigger world. That's one use of representation. On the other hand, there is the inverse use of representations, which is reducing the world to my size. So something crazy happens and I say, yeah, that's just capital doing its thing. Like suddenly no novelty, I know everything. I think those are like two specters, like two ends of a same specter. What we do with representations can either push it to one side, push it to the other, right? And it's very, 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 very hard to push names, whatever they are, to concretely increase the world politically for us. Very quickly, it becomes a way of just saying, I know where I am. So like in my daily practice, I use some concepts. Social reproduction is useful to start thinking about some problems that you could not think about. Thinking about the fact that there are many organizations helps us think that I shouldn't just act in my little collectives as if exactly as Victor said in our last meeting about Rodrigo's book, like as if I'm going to make the revolution happen. You need to be able to think as if what the real agent is something that's not you. It's like the mixture of all these things that are going on. You can use all those concepts, but value. Can you use that concept? Like, is there any action you're going to take in your life that comes from the idea of value? It's very hard to turn value into something that is operating on this side of the spectrum, where it's making your world bigger. Most of the time, it's just telling you you're on the right side. Like, why is a crisis happening and you have less money? Do the value form? Have you never read Kurtz, like Crisis Capitalism? You're not doing anything. You're not changing anything. You're going to wake up and sleep exactly as you every day. You just use that to justify to yourself that you're in the right position. That's like everyone's ideology. Like that's nothing different from what any worker does in their own mind. It's just that part of that ideology is telling you that if you're acting because of that, then you're not just a worker, right? So I think that our approach to this idea of intelligibility, that you measure it in terms of interactions, that it's connected with specific compositions of situations, it helps to ground all of that back into, okay, but what is organized because of all this discourse? It might be nothing, right? I mean, I really like, there's this psychoanalyst, this American psychoanalyst who says that the biggest challenge, like the greatest obstacle against revolution is that everyone thinks they're already revolutionary. Like you have private fantasies about how revolutionary you are, do small little rituals to show to yourself that that's true. And then you already did everything you had to do and you can live your life exactly as you should. So a lot of what we call theory, if you just think of it in organizational aspects, it's not broadening the world, it's not creating new things you can decide upon. It's just confirming that you are in the right place, right? Doing exactly what you're doing. So I think that it totally turns, it's a guy called Todd McGowan. He has a book called Enjoying What We Don't Have, something like this. It's a really cool book. So that's, I think, a nice consequence of what we're saying, which goes exactly in the direction of your critique, Felipe. Like it totally sides with that, like not being seduced by this theoretical view, not confusing it with knowledge as implied in practice, but you even get to ask, what is theory doing in terms of being implied in practice? And what I like about this approach is that this thing we were talking about in terms of, like Michael said about, well, there is something inherent in organizing at a larger scale where there is things are not connected. You need to connect it. You don't have access. There is no centralization. You need to construct how information comes across. At that moment, which is also why I think that it's very hard to think the problem of theory and practice as if it's a binomial. It's actually a three-part thing. There are practices, theories, and forms of organizing. It's not reducible to any of the two. So when you have many meetings happening in different departments, what actually is making things intelligible or not is not what particular people in the company are thinking in terms of their relevance in the world. It's the actual documents you write with what is relevant to some other department, right? That's, let's say, the organizational thing making this whole complex thing intelligible to itself, right? So I think that one way of thinking about this that puts these inquiries in the organizational perspective could be something like this. If we go back to all the different theories along the 20th century that require some reflexive movement, right? So the class in itself and for itself, the workers becoming conscious, something like this self-movement of emancipation, right? I think one of the claims we're making is that this arrow that goes from something back to itself, it's not for free just because it's reflexive. Like just because it's something dealing with itself doesn't mean it doesn't need mediations, right? So exactly as Rafael said, like I'm the one acting in my financial life, but there is no way of becoming conscious of my financial life. Like that doesn't exist. Like becoming conscious of your financial life can just be your way of not thinking about it, thinking that, yeah, I just act so consciously, I have it figured out. You need the spreadsheet to actually make something appear, right? So I think that's at that level that we're introducing the problem of inquiry. That's how I see it. Like, that's why it starts before even asking the question, are you addressing it to workers? Are you addressing it to yourself? Simply because you cannot take for granted that what is important about what you're doing, what makes a difference in what you're doing, the part of it which is we can survive your own context and therefore connect you to the context of other political movements, that part will come for free. So how do you call that theory of this self arrow, right? Of this in itself becoming its for itself when you cannot count on it being given for free in any sense? It needs to be constructed step by step, right? And I think that when Vitor says, like, correct me if I'm wrong, Vitor, if I understood it wrong, but it's becoming clearer and clearer that part of what makes this arrow impossible is that there are people who think because they're concerned with that mediation, that reflexivity, that they're spared being part of precarious worker and so on. Like they use it to distinguish themselves. right? And it's becoming clear that one of the consequences of this arrow actually existing is that that distinction disappears more than is confirmed, right? That's why I think in some level, it doesn't really matter to start like, let's ask, you know, who the really suffering people are thinking. Like, fucking hell, we can't even tell what we're thinking. Like, I know what I'm thinking in my mind with my theories, like, but that's not really the thinking that is in practice that we are collectively working with. Like, how do you get confronted with that, right? So, for example, I think there's a very interesting kind of experience, because that Vitor can also share if he thinks it's appropriate here, but like Vitor has been writing like political texts about political experiences in Brazil for like 10 years, I don't know. But they're also kind of journalistic, but it's clearly addressed to the political left itself, you know? Like, there is this internal kind of necessity to communicate what went wrong. It's not theory, because we're describing situations, what people were saying. Usually, like, you know, it's a form of thought and not just a know-how. Because I think that's where I would make the distinction. The know-how doesn't tell you you're not who you thought you were, right? Like, when I solve a problem, I try to solve a problem, like, it's not, I'm the guy solving the problem. But like, when you confront like a failure of a movement, you might find out we got everything wrong. We were fetishizing people. We didn't know what to do. Like, we might come out on the other side, like, realizing we're not who we thought we were, right? So I think there's also something that thought has as a kind of characteristic that we also want to keep. Sometimes when you realize what we actually achieved, you say, fuck, there was all this revolutionary theory, but the cool thing was just making friends. Like, that's the aggregate result. A lot of random people met and became friends. Like, is that zero? That's not zero. Like, it wouldn't have happened any other way. So it did something. But then that's the real result, not like revolutionizing the world, right? So you might be confronted with something you didn't know who you were doing or you were part of. I think that's also another characteristic of this. Yeah, anyway.
Let me just add one thing to what Gabriel said before passing it on to John. I think there's one thing that's very interesting that at least interests me more in Vitor's analysis than I generally find people investigating right-wingers, is that Vitor makes it very clear how hard a work it is to organize the right. It is not something that's a given. It is not something that's ready-made. I mean, we can fantasize about how the deep Brazil is like right-winger in essence and whatever. And even if it is, and Vitor can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of work that is done to make this thing work. And when you talk about, when you see this, I mean, it should serve, I mean, what is the knowledge that this teaches me in the left? It's that I don't have to be so frustrated with the fact that it is hard to organize, because they are people with lots of more financial resources than any of us, but it does take a lot of work to organize that. I mean, this is one of the things that really pisses me off in the fetishizing, I don't know, fetishization. You guys understand what I say, of indigenous struggle. I mean, we can say all we want about how indigenous people are resisting, etc., and we will. But I mean, if you follow the people who do the organizing of indigenous resistance and struggle, it is not something that's pre-given because they are simply forces of nature. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of meetings. It takes a lot of building up these communities. And it's important to remind that, like, if you take into account indigenous communities, a lot of them will hate themselves because of the affinity structures which is built into their social relations. So if there is something to learn, is that organizing takes practice, and not is something that's not pre-given. I mean, this is at least something that this whole structure and the attempts to describe these transmissions, I think it makes it makes this clear for me. But John, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is really good stuff and very much like, I think, timely, and I really appreciate your question, Felipe, because I think it's a really good way to frame something that we're all kind of working towards and thinking through. And I think one thing, like going back to the kind of the title of the talk and like the idea of case studies, I kind of want to approach that from two different angles in relation to like these past few comments. So I recently discovered and started digging into the Sao Paulo housing occupation movement, which is really interesting and really exciting. And just for context, I guess it didn't copy. I'll share the link in a second, but I found it through an Al Jazeera article. So I was involved in Occupy, and then for the 2 years after that was heavily involved in a homeless movement in Eugene, Oregon, which by American standards was pretty successful, but is nothing like the scale or the complexity or the success of what's happening there. And so I think one aspect of a case study is like, and where this theory for me is really powerful, is like, what does it mean to learn from that housing occupation movement in the context of the United States? Not just the United States, but in my particular Pacific Northwest location with its very different situation than the South or Northeast or whatever, right? Like, what are the actual ways that I can be careful of doing what gringos in particular are known for doing, and fetishizing struggles of peoples from elsewhere and starting to, oh, the Kurds are doing this and the Zapatistas is doing that. We're just going to take this and I've been part of that moment. I've done that thing. And like, it's hard coming from a very depoliticized country not to look outside and try to find anything, but it's also, I think, a real question in the context of STP with the peripheralization theory. Like, how do places that are, quote, core, though I think part of what makes the US so effective at what it does, it's actually got a very domestic internalized periphery with reservations and ghettos and whatnot. But I think that's part of what I'm learning from studying, right? Like there's still the feedback loop of learning from peripheries. But I don't think that necessarily translates into the way that we can kind of like study the differences in structures, the differences in conditions, and the similarities, I think, in organizational logic, right? Like, and I think part of this isn't just about different kinds of inquiries. It's like looking at a movement and saying how the movement has divided labor according to these different places, right? Like if you look at the housing occupation movement, it's got a media wing, it's got legal representation, it's got internal logistics for food, for housing, it's got security, it's got a store in many places right there. And they're very different in different cases, right? And you can kind of either go with the listing method, and just kind of go off on everything that's happening and just put it 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can kind of privilege your favorite moment, whether it's a kind of like communal aspect or kind of militant public struggle or whatnot. But how do you actually map an ecosystem for its own sake, like based upon what people are actually doing and thinking? And that's where I think like I agree with Gabriel about the emphasis on thinking, because if you're going to ask the question of how to learn from the housing occupation movement, you're asking the question of what did people learn? What have people been thinking? How have they been changing each other's thinking? What does it mean for the leaders of the movement to be like leading that movement? And how do people interact with those leaders? Because there are clear, like when I go to the websites, there are clear leaders. There are people that have been identified as having brought some kind of intelligibility and been capable of carrying out certain kinds of interactions and had a vision to compose certain kind of movements. So what does it mean to learn from that and to actually translate it? And this was a major question of the Third International. So much of Gramsci's writings around this, like how do you take the Russian experience and translate it elsewhere? What does it mean to learn that in Italy versus learn that in China? They're very different things. And in a way, I think that this gives us a far more supple analysis, because if you look at a lot of the theories at the time, they tend to get into like the bad sense of Platonists, right? Like, why does the state do this? Well, it's a special committee of the ruling class. But why is it doing it this way and not that way? Well, it helps the interest of the ruling class. Yeah, you just said that, but why is it true? Like, this has been a major problem for me with the American left, because it takes all these party strategies from parliamentary countries which has an entirely different electoral mechanism than what the United States has an entirely different government apparatus in terms of divisions of federal and state powers. And it completely ignores precisely what I think our analysis brings to the surface, which are the real systemic differences between places. And if we're going to learn from something like the Sao Paulo movement, it's not enough to just learn from the movement. You also have to look at the structure of Sao Paulo more generally. Why is Sao Paulo also the place where the student occupation movement took off, where the PCC took off, right? Like a whole range of different highly radical, highly explosive movements occurred in a place that, I mean, again, you can just kind of, in a bad idealist sense, say, well, the people are suffering there. Sure, but people are suffering all over the place. And like, how do you even differentiate that? There's some things, whatever, to be learned. But I think on top of that, the other aspect of a case study that's important is, I do think, as much like we do have to have the practical aspects, but also like everyone, including like practical thinking Lenin, had their moments of retracting and reading The Science of Logic or whatever that they chose to like have. And I do think that is an important moment. It's not a self-fulfilling moment, but it is like a necessary step at certain points in any kind of working through issues. And I think part of what case studies offer for us, and I think when we're looking at like, how do we apply this to say like my interest in the history of the Mongolian Empire, and versus like, how do you actually study like the student occupation movement versus how do you look at the courier strike and how that relates to Uberization and blah, 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 right? Like the case studies become a kind of tangible place where we can actually not get caught up in the theoretical abstractions and actually like test the ideas out, but in a way that I really like Gabriel's point of this from a conversation of like kind of distilling our theory down so we can drop it and it can kind of like take off. Because I think ultimately we do have to count on the fact that people think, and we're developing something for other people to pick up and do God knows what with that we can't possibly predict. And I just hope that what we can do in these moments is like distill it, clarify it, test it, so that as we know, as things get intense, like it can actually do some pretty real good. And I think that like these moments of trying to like take a very real struggle and test these ideas out as ways to understand them. I don't know, for me personally, not just theoretically, but like insofar as I'm trying the little bit I can to agitate my workplace and whatnot right now, like this has actually been helpful to me to understand how the boss dynamics play out and how to think through so many different dimensions of that. And I'll talk about that actually in my presentation a bit, so I won't go into it now, but it is, to me, it's been very practically helpful.
Very, very excited for your presentation, John. And I think you touched on something that's very important, which is the fact that whatever we do, it, in a sense, it has to deal with these, we are dealing with singular conditions, singular acts in singular contexts, which are not translatable in general terms. I mean, we are not trying to deduce the laws of histories, but we are interested in the fact, and I'm not even saying that we have the monopoly on these forms of affecting, but we are interested in understanding a form of expression, a form of organizing a discourse that at the same time, I think these are only constraints that I'm enumerating. They preserve the singularity of the situation, so it's not generalizable. So we have to account for the context, but it also has to make sense for the person who is receiving this, but not in the sense that he or she is simply applying this to their context because their context is different. And also, it has to transmit something between context without predetermining what is it that is being transmitted. And I think this is the gist of the problem in my sense, and why I think what you say mean, it really touches on the problem, which is like, these things are helping us in concrete situations. We don't know exactly how they are helping out. And this is why I think the image of the analyst is a good one. The analyst, he is also a subject of analysis. He is also going to a therapist or talking about his situation. And what he has to offer to the subject he is being the analyst for, he cannot predetermine how he will use what he has to offer. So I think these are sets of conditions that we have to account for. And this, I think, is the most interesting thing that we have to work out is, and this is why I don't agree totally with what Michael said about a standard questionnaire. I mean, we might do a standard questionnaire, but it's up to the people how they will use this questionnaire. I mean, so in a sense, there's this freedom in the form of connection, this asymmetry in the connections that I think is something that should be preserved, not because we think this will solve the problems, but because in a sense, I think we are already being helped in this manner. We talk about our situations, we talk about our impasses that are different, and somehow we are able to have a higher degree of freedom in a sense. So I really liked what you said, John, because I think it goes to the heart of the problem.
Sorry, can I just add something? I mean, I know I'm speaking a lot. Can you guys hear me, or is it? I just froze here for a second. Yeah, because I mean, I think it connects with what Michael was saying there, with what John said, and also with Felipe's point, because, for example, I think there's more of this challenge, of these challenges we're talking about, in the possibility, like, let's just be very direct, right? I mean, organization means supposedly that you have more time. That's what's meant to do, right? I mean, organizing is not making things tidy. Sometimes you have less time if you're going to make everything tidy. But when you do things collectively in what we call organized way, that means that it takes less time to do things together than it would by yourself. Sometimes it will take infinite time by yourself, and it takes a finite amount of time with others, right? So when you take organization from that point of view, you can see that there is a form of transmission which is not direct contact or interacting together, but there has something to do with sparing time. For example, not making the same mistakes. Like, what, instead of having to reinvent the wheel, right? As John was saying, like, I don't wanna, like, I think that the problem is sometimes framed in terms of learning, or like historically in the left, in the Marxist left, I think we have the discourse of kind of how to do what happened in the October Revolution again. And then there's all these different kind of ways of being more nuanced about it. Like, you cannot repeat it, you cannot apply it manually, you need to learn from your concrete analysis of the concrete conjecture and so on. But ultimately, it looks like a bit, you know, the best you can do is framed in terms of learning from the past. And I think that it is one of the ways in which what happened in other organizations or political processes can latch onto what we're doing now, right? I would say something like this, like, you have learning processes when we're able to, like, the form of organizations is able to survive, even though organizations don't survive. So we register them in documents, in texts, in the experience of people, and that kind of allows us to, the people who come after, they can benefit from that and not make the same mistakes. They can do other mistakes, can learn more things. So you save time in a certain sense. I know, Michael, that's not where we were. I'm just like saying one of the ways this can be transmitted. The other way, which I think the same problem appears, again, concrete problem, is many things are happening at once. how can they influence each other in a way that, for example, we lower the cost of doing things. Like there's a place where you have a bunch of teachers organizing, and there's a place where there's a lack of teachers. Like, why are these teachers in excess not composing with those places without teachers? Or these people have a lot of access to some resource. That place is lacking that resource. Why isn't this not connected to that? Right? That's a different way of propagating, where it's not the form that gets autonomized from organizations and lives on to influence another, but that needs to be materially determined. How does it survive, right? So like in a book, but then the book needs to get to the right hands. It's better for sometimes to have a small printing press that gets the book into the right hands than public doing it like for everyone and nothing happens. So, but then I think it's just trying to kind of, I think the basis of all of this is trying to add the problem of inquiries to the bulk, like to be one aspect or one possible kind of tool in the collection of these other types of problems, right? So probably like having a map of the left in a country that's done in one way so that people can benefit, perhaps it's not even that useful compared to, I don't know, different types of procedures more locally defined, right? But for example, I find it very interesting when John says something like, yeah, I'm looking into São Paulo's housing movement and thinking about our own process. I have the impression, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, why aren't housing processes connected, right? It is itself an interesting organizational fact that organizing in one place doesn't make it interesting to connect in an organizational level with another place, right? And I have the impression that there is also a kind of, I think I was talking to John about this, like I feel like there is a sort of scale of lack of resistance to organization, right? When you organize people's lives, there is resistance that comes from the need to survive, like material reproduction of your existence. When you organize at the level of ideas, you don't need to survive. The resistance of the world against ideas is much smaller. Like it's like they circulate in a kind of an oily surface. Very low resistance. It's very cheap, right? And it's interesting because ultimately it's just a substitute to even stronger connections that could be made at a level where there is more resistance. So you can actually imagine a continuum where, for example, directly connecting the housing movement in the States and Brazil requires a lot of energy, but also creates a really kind of, requires a lot of innovation and a very steady kind of transformation, right? Connecting at the level of passing experiences has some resistance because you need to think a lot to adapt to context, learn what you want to take out of it and so on. But it still can produce a strange bond. Suddenly people can adopt similar slogans. They can see themselves as part of the same movement. And then at the very, very top of this ladder of, cheap connections with no cost comes philosophical universalism. Like the theoretical statement that things are the same costs absolutely nothing, connects things automatically, right? But also is a bond that has absolutely no consequence. So I find it nice to make like this, like to put inquiry somewhere in the middle of this, like to be able to meet, like to produce some level of concrete connection where there is no one detached looking from the outside, to produce some sort of inquiries of different natures where you're learning something from organizations you're a part of. You can import methods, you can import experience, you can learn about their failures and not do so. There is some organizational kind of benefit because you might still save some effort, right? You spend effort connecting to reduce effort once you've organized together. And at the level of philosophical universality, like it's very cheap to create the organization, the connection, but it has no consequence. It doesn't save you any effort. So I like kind of doing that continuum, but I was trying to follow the conversation in the chat, and I totally lost.
But I do think that there's this point that you brought up, which is the cost, which is, I think, the same problem that that we find. I think Vitor is really saying it in a way that is very clear, where the point is not simply to understand the other, but to understand the game of don't we have the game of, what is it, taking and reasons, stuff, sellers. There are no Salersians today. The game of giving and taking reasons, giving and asking for reasons. Thank you, Felipe. I think in a sense, these questions that that Vitor is mentioning in the chat, they are very important, not in the sense of, and this I think is the interesting point. I think it's very easy to get lost in this game of simply pointing out reasons for failure, or the other side of it, which is what Vitor also said, which is like, this will be the one, this will be the struggle that will end all struggles, because we this time we know how to do it. And I think that the main issue is not exactly thinking of things in terms of a final defeat or a final victory, but these struggles, they are how do I say it? They are contemporaneous to the act of inquiry. There is not a division, I think, and this I think is the point of some inquiries. There's not a division between this knowledge will be used later. I think that's the point, is this inquiry into the defeats, in a sense, or not into the defeats, but into how does a crime lord take over an occupation camp, or how does what was the other one? The courier group is brought off by politicians. I am guessing that the inquiry into that itself is already the establishment of a link with those involved that does not establish a separation between inquirers and those who are involved in the situation. This is seen as there's a simultaneity between those two actions. I think it's not either or case where you either get yourself involved and help the couriers to free themselves from the syndicate, which is backed by the company, or like, oh, I'm going to understand what they do. I think it's the same questions that, and in a sense, this again is a point where the element of interaction, I think, of the discourses appears, and the difficulty, I think. But I think if we take into account what Michael said, I think Michael, this is something we've talked about a lot, about creating a place, a website where these informations would move about. And now that I think about it, and this I think is the hard part, because the act of creating the space is already the act of the inquiry, in the sense that you have to know what is it that will link you up to those who you are connecting to. You cannot simply connect, you cannot simply establish this place abstractly. And I'm not saying that you are saying that, Michael, but I do think that in a sense, the work of inquiry is political already, in the sense that if you are creating this space where this information circulates, and I think it's something that Felipe said when he was mentioning a letter from Marx, you already have the organization, the class is already there if you are if this information is flowing. But the fact that these exchanges are not easy and they have to be built up, they have to be established, means also that you have to let go of the idea that I mean, not let go, because I think these ideas, they serve a purpose in some sense. But I think there's a reason why Mao and Marx did different inquiries. It's not a matter of personal preference. I think it's a matter, it's the fact that those were situations that demanded different responses. I mean, Marx, I think it's very telling that Marx did his inquiry in the year before he died. So it's like there was 50 years of intellectual experience that he had collected from all his different involvements in politics. And there's this, so I don't think these choices are arbitrary. And I think the task is, in a sense, not getting down with it, but actually taking the inquiry as itself already a political act. But that implies, and I think this is the difficulty, implies us having to look at the inquiry not as something that will produce an effect after or later, but as something that in the process itself. And I think that's really hard, because being involved politically is horrible, because you have to, you are always, you always have to be less of yourself, and it's terrifying, I think, in a sense.
Can I just bring then a practical thing for just to, I know we're coming to a close, but just so we don't forget to mention it. You know, we're having this meeting in Brazil in a couple of weeks, and there is one possibility on the table right now, which is to do the public meeting we wanted to have. Like, we're having a closed meeting for the STP members or guests and so on. And we wanted to do a public thing where we tell some people who are interested in what we've been up to and so on. And one of the places where we can do this public thing is occupation that Vitor here had contact with, another comrade who's organizing that occupation with some other people. And one of the ideas that was kind of suggested is that we could offer back to them, because we're not going to get many people there. We can really bring like some material resource to kind of as a return for giving us the space. One thing we could do is to try to organize some interviews with people who are in the occupation, and then edit them and give them the material so they can use for something. It would also be beneficial for us, because it allows us to pose very concretely the question of what would be a sort of question or an interaction that we would record that would, make any sense from our perspective. So I think we can also bring like a very, I mean, I'm not sure if this is either A, not that we decided to do this, it's not clear yet. B, if we propose it to them that they will accept it, but let's say those two things are a yes, then what would we do, right? In terms of what type of question or what type of interaction could be useful. On one hand, consider, the use they might want from the material, but also consider how we approach this thing. Yeah. Yeah, Branson.
Yeah. I'm not thinking, I'm recovering from food poison, so I'm not drinking.
Oh shit.
Very straight. But yeah, I've been trying to think in more practical terms, like the what the sorts of inquiries we could make, because and I don't know, like there's the distinctions. I think I remember from Marcelo's book that I think the Maoists did between the inquiries, the bilan, balance, like the balance sheet, and the, how do they call the immersions, the établissements.
Yeah.
So, and I think you can roughly understand them in terms of like, you arrive, you look at like the investigation is something that you sort of like arrive as a stranger, right? And from the outside, and the établissement is something that you participate from the inside, and the balance sheet of something that already has elapsed, and then you sort of like go back and
Mao Zedong had that triad of he had a metaphor. You go to the countryside and you pick
yeah,
a
yeah,
flower,
that's-
you
yeah.
go and you smell the flower and you plant flowers, right?
Yeah. And yeah, I think it would be useful also like thinking the sort of the degree of interaction that we're gonna like try with. And also I've been thinking in terms a lot of like exactly if we think that this inquiry as a sort of like an exchange or an interaction that's bidirectional, what sorts of things we can offer, and on the other hand, what sorts of things we can hear from that inquiry. So what we can offer is like, it can be like the sort of questions we were able to make, right? So the sorts of problems that if our framework is useful, like we should be able to also like make it useful in some way by also maybe making questions or like showing things that are sort of like invisible in some way. But I mean, it can also be like, as we said, like we can pay for the time of them to hear them. If we're not even like sure that we can offer something, we can just like, so there are many kinds of ways we can sort of like try to offer things. And also like, how can we, because I think it's also like the sort of like the way we receive effects from these inquiries it has to do a lot of like the presentation from Dinas, I think he did on like what was it called, like generic listening, like this ability of being able to hear more than what's sometimes even like what the people from the organizations are even able to hear, right? So there's also a bad that we don't have to trust everything they say. So so I think that's something like interesting to think about. And also beyond this sort of like, instead of like giving reasons and asking for giving and asking reasons, this sort of like offering and listening thing, I think there's two other dimensions which I think are interesting. One is the sort of like bond we think we can make with this sort of inquiries, right? So getting to know like other organization and experience is also a way to build like a sort of network. And the second thing, the second aspect of this sort of bonding through interaction, I think is the mapping, right? Because as you bond, you also produce a sort of map that helps not only like to map the terrain, but also to like locate this bond inside a new space, right? So I think it's also interesting to ask like, what are the sort of like products in terms that can be made visible, that can make our relationship visible to ourselves in this exchange, but also to the outside. So like, what sort of thing we can bring back, for example, to this space once we do or make public. So I think there's these different levels that would be interesting to sort of like flesh out in more concrete terms. Because as I've been like thinking about inviting people from, I don't know, the indigenous movement, from the cooperative school, I've been thinking of like what sort of like questions I would ask, that so that it wouldn't be just like a common sort of like, I don't know, just report on what they're experiencing, so like what kind of questions I could ask, but also what kind of stuff I could sort of like offer in exchange. So I think it would be nice to sort of, I think we can use the event in Rio to actually like brainstorm a lot about these questions.
One thing that I was thinking of, Lorenzo, I'm not sure what you think, but I think that one of the things that makes this problem almost intractable, because we're not doing anything, like we don't have anything to offer proper, and so it always seems to make it impossible, is to never perhaps think of this as a connection between this group and whoever will receive or invite, but always think about it as like 2 interviews form 1 unit, you know, where you talk to someone, you talk to another one, and what you can give is the connection between them. Is that we form like a 3rd point to which now you can think of a relation between the other 2, because then there is still a virtuous problem of opportunity of coming up with the right duos, right? But suddenly it's no longer a problem of, so the right duos in the sense of, well, let's do some meetings, let's do some of these things. Well, let's try to do 2 occupations in Rio, or let's do with like some people in you know, like I was talking to Vitor a long time ago, we were talking about exactly this that he did. He was talking to some people who had some, I don't know what we were talking about, like some guard, like they were doing some popular agriculture, but they had a hard time getting supplies. And we were talking about, okay, you could talk to the courier movement to see if there's no way that these 2 things could connect. So like you do, yeah, exactly, like a relation in that sense. So perhaps something of the problem comes from the idea that there is a dual relationship between inquirer, which is us, and interviewed or inquiry, rather than something that puts itself between 2 things that, you know, like in a provisory way, they look like inquiries in the sense that they look like we're interested in raising questions, asking some questions, but you already get a feeling for relevant questions when you know they need to be relevant when you're going to do a second one, you know, and then like it even implies perhaps that you always need to plan 2 meetings with everyone, one with them and one after you spoke with someone else, right? Something like this, like perhaps the unit that is able to kind of make these exchanges more plausible is a unit that includes more than just 2 organizations, you know? It's like the micro version of what Michael said, like something like if you think globally, we did like with the platform, right? Imagine what if we had like this big kind of platform where you can kind of map a lot of things and make it visible like globally, right? Perhaps we should just turn it around and think about the basic unit of making something visible. It would include 2 organizations, not 1, and us in the middle of this, right? Suddenly, the actual tools we have, they become practical tools because you're not trying to give them something we don't have. You're trying to give them something that the other organization has, right? Yeah, right, something like that. Like I think that there's something there that perhaps makes more sense as the basic unit for this sort of thing, right?
But if we take that into account, then it doesn't even have to be 2 organizations in the sense of political organizations. It could be 1 political organization and something other. I don't know how that would work in practice, but I'm just saying that but it's an interesting idea. I'm enjoying it. Go ahead, Vitor.
Two things. First, I think we can offer something of symbolic and political value to the occupation, because specifically this occupation is an occupation of the Academia Brasileira de Letras, an institution that was founded by Machado de Assis, a writer that was Black and Republican and anti-slavery, and we can put a leftist interpretation of Machado. I think he's a leftist. He hated everyone, but he had to hide it like I do. Because I mean, I don't hide it, but he had to. He didn't have Twitter. Maybe if he had, he wouldn't have a career, probably. And I think by launching a book with intellectuals and people and speaking as if that was a legitimate place of the Academia Brasileira de Letras, the true Academia Brasileira de Letras, having more people do that, I think it would be politically valuable to them. And in this specific case, that they are occupying a building that was left unused by an institution that is like an university or something like that. That is my first point. My second, I think Rafael is right. I think the live today, discussing the book of Gabriel Edmilson is proof that when the left discusses left composition, they start talking about random shit and,
Totally.
and not about.
It was the most random.
We're not about composition. Paulo Arantes, for example, occupies a specific spot in Brazilian left that has a relationship with PT, with PSDB, with MDB. He knows that, but he doesn't say it. He speaks about the crisis of capital and that's not the point. Sabrina, it's the same thing. It's not about climate crisis. We're talking about our own problems. Why can't we talk? Why can't we organize together? What are the problems? So I think we need a practical problem that places people with concrete questions that they can't escape from, like this one that you mentioned. The favela has a distribution problem of seeds. The cooperative of couriers has a problem. They have very few clients. They can't compete with iFood. So maybe if we match these two, and we can match them and match them as a political activity that we consider important because of our reflection about the need of that kind of connection. If we can put people together and have them talk and try to mediate, maybe that is a sort of use and experiment. And from that, we can produce knowledge of how the model works. And we can think of other problems, but that is the one that I could think was most immediately. But there are hundreds of other problems like that, like people that need to print leaflets, people that need to communicate to another part of town, and there's a movement there, there's a movement here, they don't speak to each other. Why? Maybe, and you know, that's it.
Yeah, it's a housing occupation. There's quite a lot about it on the web. I can send you guys a link.
Guys, does anybody, do you want to add something, Gabriel?
I just wanted to say something very nerdy, but we started talking about this. There's something nice about psychoanalysis as an idea that you can, connect, like you're not adding anything, but you can be of service to somebody listening themselves. And I think that what we just said now has a really nice analogy, because in psychoanalysis, there is this famous idea that a signifier represents a subject to another signifier, right? A part of speech, the way it relates to another part of speech, that's how you learn where the subject is. That's composition. And I think when we say something like, we want to see how one organization can connect with another, it has that familiar feel that an organization represents a subject to another organization, right? So perhaps there's good reason why when you move from the problem of who speaks to whom and who listens to proper organizational problems, which are not just a matter of discourse. First, you should move away from just one group speaking and actually move to how one organization relates to the other, right? And there's something in between the two and how they can get composed together that actually speaks to what sort of political subjectivity is at stake. So there, if we want to take this analytic analogy further, that idea that the basic unit is not composed of the discourse of one organization when you meet them once, but actually composed of this triangle where you have at least 2 meetings and the point of view where you try to see if there's no connection possible, right? It's not like we need to be like consultants who propose solutions. You can just do it like with 3 meetings, you can create this problem without adding anything. You listen to one, you listen to the other, then you relay what one said to the other, or you have a meeting with everyone. Like suddenly, you know, you can have that process being developed without somebody coming from the outside and having the solution. So, I mean, regardless of where solutions come from, you can have many models for that anyway, right? But I think that there's something in that basic idea that makes a lot of sense. I don't know.
Yeah, just a small comment, because now I'm thinking the example that me and Vitor use in the text, which is the video inquiry. In a sense, the video, which was the sort of result of the sort of interaction, was the sort of third element that was used to sort of evaluate the nature of the relationship, right? So we had this objective third term, which if the video was useful for the careers and also for us, we learned something that it meant that we had a relationship. So actually there was this third term. It was the video.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I mean, also, if the video is helpful to some couriers and helpful to other couriers, then those 2 groups of couriers actually have a connection.
Yeah.
Right. So even the original idea I mentioned, like, what if we, you know, do some interviews and give them this material, or if we have to publicize the material, even in that case, you're still talking about trying to come up with a third thing that connects one organization to another. Like that seems to be a better building block to think about these things, right? Then like there is reality and organization, and then there's something coming out of it to the outside, right? It's better to think that it comes from one place to the other in the same kind of space.
Yeah.
But it just takes work, and it usually takes effort and it costs to make this sort of create a medium, create a channel, right? At first it looks like it's useless. So it makes sense that a kind of organizations concerned with that connection exist, because it's not a natural, obvious thing to do. Like, especially when, you know, everyone is working too much. It makes sense that the first thing organizations would cut out is efforts that go into lateral connections, because you need to concentrate all your efforts into just reproducing your own organization. So you can even describe this probably as an economic problem, right? And it would make sense that something needs to like pay the cost for that sort of connection. So it's a kind of, that's where I disagreed with Sam Moss, Victor, in the text, where he says, small groups are becoming impotent, or they are impotent already in the 30s, because working class doesn't need this sort of intellectual small groups. But that impotence is a good sign, because it might mean that there is a convergence happened between workers without the mediation of these intellectual theories. But there might be like a job in the retaguard, like in the back as well, right? Where things are developing, they don't need anyone from the outside. But then in certain moments where the economic cost of these compositions might be too high, something does that stitching, right? Or at least facilitates that triangulation. I think it's a way of thinking about it.
I also really like this because it displaces the function from a sort of all-seeing eye. The function of providing these connections is not a top-down explanation of how things work. So I think it actually frees up these efforts in trying to compose, so they don't have to fall into their own neurosis about, oh, what is my place in this situation? Oh, I am not one of you. Oh, etc., etc. And I do think there's something that I was thinking that it might be important in this context that these exchanges are private, that they remain private, and then this network is not an open network. In a sense, not that it has to be closed off, but this is something that I think some of us have discussed in a lot of moments. But this is information that can be used and can be used for other means. So if this is something that is to be addressed in the sense that to compose concrete connections, I think it has to take into account that there is I don't know if private is the right word, but it is not public in the sense that it is open for anyone and everyone in this abstract sense that we are producing something. I mean, it is something to be seized, and this knowledge or connection or inquiry or whatever, it is to be used in the way that those who are involved want, but I think that now that I think about it, it should not be open in this irrestricted sense. It should be conditioned, I think. I don't know. But that's something maybe we can work out how to negotiate these elements when we get down to it. But everyone, I think it's 9. Everybody's probably tired, but I just want to
Renzo
thank
is
you all.
dying.
Renzo is dying. Renzo, I am you tomorrow or in a couple of days, because you will soon be disintoxicated.
Yeah, Rafael went through something similar, really recently.
Yeah.
Renzo's
There was
just partying too much in the north of Brazil. You ate like some crazy food in Amazon.
It was actually the boat from Belém to Macapá. We drank we ate the food of the boat. That wasn't not even the locals. It ate the food, like they brought in the food.
Oh, so you guys
imagine
were
us from São Paulo.
You guys were really touristing. Like, let's do this. Let's eat the local food. But guys, thank you again. And next week it's Michael, I think. He's going to talk about his research. But thank you again for this open discussion. I think this is a model that we could try and do more often. It was a bit, I think I was too formal in the beginning, but I think once things picked up, it was excellent. And I think maybe we should try. Yeah, we should try and do these kinds of more open discussions, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Guys, I need to go as well. It was such a pleasure. Monica, really good to see you here.
Okay. See you all,
Hey,
guys.
I need to go and drink.
See you next time.
After
Bye-bye.
today's live. Which was terrible.
I think it's good. I think it's good.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Get those small bottles of gin and check it out.
See you guys.
See you guys. Bye-bye.